Well, I'd now like to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Brad Smith. He's the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Nature Conservation Council of New South Wales, of which Climate Action Burwood Canada Bay is a member. Brad started his career as an electrical engineer and completed a PhD at the University of Queensland in 2010. For 15 years, he's been working to speed up the transition to clean energy, from volunteering with community groups to working in federal parliament for 3 years as an advisor to Senator Larissa Waters. For the last 6 years, he's led the NCC's Climate and Energy Campaign, which contributed to the New South Wales government legislating a $32 billion renewable energy roadmap and improving its climate targets. Tonight, he's going to speak to us on a wide range of climate-related topics. If you've got any questions for Andrew, please put them in the chat and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. Okay, over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Ken.
Right.
It's Brad.
Brad, sorry.
That's all right. Lovely to be with you all. And yeah, thanks for inviting me tonight. Always great to get to a community event. And yeah, and your group has so much to be proud of. So good to be speaking to you. And thanks for that kind introduction. I'm dialing in from Katoomba up on Darug and Gundagara country, and I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land I'm working on. And I actually just came from a talk by a new organisation called the First Nations Renewable Energy Network, First Nations Clean Energy Network, I think they're called, sorry. And that group really highlighted how this transition we're underway on, from dirty energy to clean energy, and from dirty exports to clean exports, hopefully, we'll see huge parts of Australia, moving to becoming solar farms and wind farms and transmission lines. And that creates big opportunities for people in regions, but it also intersects with Aboriginal communities and native title and rights on the land, and and I think it's important that we keep those justice elements in front of our minds as we push for solutions to the climate crisis we're in. So thanks for having me. The topics that I was hoping to cover tonight, there's a few. First, I'll just talk a little bit about Nature Conservation Council, who we are and what we do. But then I really want to talk about the state election, which is coming up in 5 months in New South Wales. It's a really important opportunity for the climate, and I'll talk a little bit about why. But starting to the conversation is, can we make a difference as the climate movement, as small community groups working together? I'll do a little, retrospective on the last couple of elections. And then a quick update on what is the state of play in politics with the election coming up. Where are we at with climate policy? What are the different parties saying? And also in the energy market that's so crucial to the climate discussion in Australia. What we want to achieve, what do we hope to get out of the election? What do we want politicians to be doing, and how can we do it? And like Ken said, please put any questions in the chat. We'll have, I won't take too long, so we'll have plenty of time for a rich discussion afterwards. So I want to start with the last state election, which was 4 years ago. And for the Nature, well, I should first start with the Nature Conservation Council and then come to the elections. But for the Nature Conservation Council, state elections are really important because we are a New South Wales-based group. We're made up of 160 member groups across the state. Climate Action Burwood Canada Bay is one of them, and many other climate action groups across the state. Jenny Goldie is here from Climate Action Monero. I think she's dialing in from Cooma down there. And yeah, so lots of groups across the state fighting for climate, a safe climate, fighting for protecting nature and the environment in all the different forms that takes. And our real specialty at the Nature Conservation Council is working together with all those groups to achieve outcomes for climate and outcomes for nature that we all couldn't achieve by ourselves in our community groups. Ways that we can work together to really escalate those campaigns that are so important for nature and the climate. So we're a member-based organisation. The members, choose our board, set the direction, set the policies for the Nature Conservation Council, and we've just gone through a process of deciding what our election platform is for the next state election, and that's something that people on this call had input into, people in this group, and I'll talk a little bit about where we landed on that. a little bit later in the presentation. So we're very much a grassroots driven group that tries to coordinate and really put pressure on the people in Macquarie Street in New South Wales Parliament to get outcomes for nature, and that's been going pretty well. And of course, the state government is responsible for so much of our climate and environment laws and regulations. So, Ken already talked about the New South Wales Renewable Energy Zone policy that's really pushing in renewable energy and pushing out coal power, but also, regulating logging in our native forests that's responsible for huge amounts of carbon emissions as well, regulating clearing of agricultural land, waste facilities. A lot of it comes under the purview of the state government. So it's a very, very good place to be. And I feel very lucky to be working at an organisation on an issue that I'm so passionate about. Like Ken said, I was an electrical engineer by training, but pretty quickly felt a real need to work on the climate crisis and became a climate activist. And so very happy to be at the Nature Conservation Council doing that work. But let's look back at the state election in 2019. So 4 years ago, how did it go? And a lot of groups came together around a shared agenda for that election about a clean energy future for New South Wales, where the government would push in much more renewable energy and start to wean the state off coal. So we came together, we agreed on a policy agenda, and then we got out and we organised. And in a lot of communities, this photo's from Coogee, one of the seats that changed hands from the Coalition to Labor at that election. We got out and spoke to neighbours, people door knocked, people put up signs, and a lot of that might be familiar to folks in this group because of the most recent federal election, but a very effective way of making sure that the issues of climate are on the agenda in these electorates where we're working, and on the minds of the members of parliament and the people making decisions in those parties. So we shifted votes when we set the story. This is an ABC News article from just before the March election in 2019. Climate change policies are a major battleground in the New South Wales election. That was definitely part of the story there. And we worked together as a movement. This photo is from the school strike in the same year where thousands of people came out and made climate a big issue and kept the pressure up. And of course, we achieved really important outcomes at that election and after it. This was some exit polling that the Nature Conservation Council commissioned on the day after the election. So we went and asked people, how did they vote? What were they thinking about when they voted in that election? And these were three of the seats where we worked. So Coogee was one of them. And when people were asked which issues were most important to them when they decided who to vote for, climate change and environment came out as the #1 issue. And that's a pretty important and surprising statistic for a lot of people, a lot of members of parliament who assume that everybody always cares about just jobs, the economy, and the cost of living. In some important places for that election, climate change environment was actually the #1 issue, ahead of the economy, ahead of health, ahead of transport, and so on. Lismore, same story, and even bigger margin, climate change and environment was the #1 issue. And even on the North Shore, climate change and environment came out ahead. The economy was a close second there, but nevertheless, we can, and we did, point to these results after the election and convince the government that they had an image problem. They were not dealing with the issues that voters wanted dealt with on climate and environment, and they needed to pick up their act. And fortunately, over the last 4 years, they've done that in a big way on climate, not so much on environment. So then skipping forward to the most recent federal election, just really quickly, here are some photos that folks here might be familiar with. Together as a movement, groups like yours and others worked together to, door knock, put up signs, and together we put up over 12,000 signs across New South Wales and made sure that climate was a big issue in the federal election. And of course, that has been such a great victory for the climate and such a huge step forward. For politicians now can't ignore the fact that the electorate wants and demands and is voting for action on climate change. So congratulations to everyone who got involved earlier this year on the federal election. So my message there is absolutely when we work together and we get out there in the community, we can make a big difference for climate at elections. And the upcoming state election is just another opportunity to take a big step forward. So what's the state of play with New South Wales policy and politics? I first want to talk about our reliance on coal for electricity. And, coal is the grey bars in this chart, and you can see up to around 2010 in the middle of the chart, New South Wales was very dependent on coal, one of the most coal-dependent grids in the world. And steadily and slowly, solar and wind has been chipping away at that reliance on coal. And you can see in the last 4 years, it's actually become, a bit of an avalanche of solar and wind, moving faster and faster into the grid. And so we're definitely heading in the right direction, and we need to speed that progress up, and we need to maintain it. But we are making a difference, and we're starting to have a much cleaner electricity grid. And that's important because coal is the largest source of climate pollution in New South Wales. And that's what this chart shows. Energy generation, this is New South Wales emissions back in 2018. They don't update the state inventories very often, unfortunately. So things have changed a bit since 2018, as I showed in that last chart. But this gives you an idea. So energy generation is almost a half of our emissions, and that's almost exclusively coal. A little bit of gas, but mostly coal. Transport comes in at number 2, and then agriculture and so on. And this picture is rapidly changing. And if we stay on the trajectory we're on, by 2025, or 26, so only in the next 2 or 3 years, transport will actually overtake energy generation as our number 1 source of emissions in New South Wales. And that milestone will happen when the Eraring power station, so Origin Energy's power station up on Lake Macquarie, it's the largest coal power station in the country, and it's scheduled to close in 2025. So if we hit that milestone, our energy generation emissions will drastically reduce, and transport will become the number 1 source of emissions in New South Wales. So what's the current policy? And this is a photo of our Climate and Energy Minister, Matt Keane. And I think this was an entry to the Archibald Prize. He's appropriately holding a burning waratah, because the story is, although he's, really tried to move his party and has achieved a lot on climate, our state is still suffering, these huge climate impacts, like the Black Summer fires and like the floods that have been hitting across the state, and especially up near Lismore. And the current policies, as much as they're a good step in the right direction, are still setting us up for an even worse climate catastrophe, and they're not in line with a 1.5 degree scenario. So New South Wales Labor and the Coalition both have a 2030 target of 50% emissions reduction. And we know from the science, and there's plenty of references to say, that Australia needs to reduce its emissions by 75% by 2030. So we've got some work to do still. We need to beat that 50% emissions reduction target. Under current policies, the last coal-fired power station in New South Wales will close around 2040. But under a 1.5 degree scenario, that needs to happen in 2030, so 10 years earlier than planned. Or if you flip it and say the other way around, we need to close them all in the next 7 years. So we've got some work to do. The government has some support for lower emissions industry. They've got some funding for industry to clean up its act. There's policies on electric vehicles and transport on bringing those things in. But those policies can and should be going harder and faster. And yeah, none of those policies are compatible with limiting global warming to safe levels, and the 1.5 degrees that Australia signed up to in Paris and reiterated in Glasgow. In terms of politics, there are 93 seats in the lower house in New South Wales, and 9 of them are held by crossbenchers. So in order for the government to change and for Labor to have a strong chance of forming a minority government with some of those crossbenchers, it would need to win 7 seats from the government. If they want a majority government, Labor would need to win 11 seats. And on the other hand, if the coalition is to continue to be in majority government, it needs to hold on to every single one of its seats. Now, the polls and the betting odds are very close. People might have seen the Australian Financial Review published a poll just yesterday, talking about how Chris Minns is ahead, Labor's ahead. People are saying that the Perrottet government's getting tired and old and, giving too many jobs to the mates and things like that. But if you look at the betting odds, which are often better predictors of the election outcome, it's really neck and neck. And the reason for that is, even if Labor's a bit ahead in the polls on a statewide level, they need to win those 7 seats. And it's, it's going to be a real challenge for them to find 7 seats where they can take those seats from the currently held by the coalition. So it's absolutely in play. It's absolutely neck and neck. And from a climate and environment point of view, that's fertile ground, because everywhere that we can say voters are concerned about climate and the environment, both parties, we can put pressure on both parties to pick up their act and put in place better policies and take New South Wales a big step forward for climate and the environment. Another dynamic in the election is the Teal independent. So that was a huge dynamic in the federal election. It's also shaping up to be in play in the state election. So seats like just north of Burwood Canada Bay in Lane Cove, there's, independent challengers are lining up in that seat. Also next door to that seat in North Shore and in Willoughby further east. And also on the other side of the harbour down near Bondi in Vaucluse. So Teal challengers are expected in those seats. And so again, the current Liberal MPs are thinking, what do I need to do to head off those challenges? Which means we should have a good opportunity, if we run our campaigns right, to get some good outcomes for the climate and the environment. So what are we calling for? And like I said, we've just been through a process of, working together with groups all across New South Wales to figure out, what are the policies that we need for climate and environment. And I'm just going to run through a quick snapshot of the highlights. But if you're interested in looking at the whole policy book, I can share a link with Ken, or I can put it in the chat, and folks can go and have a look at that policy booklet. At the moment, we're only sharing it internally with NCC members. We haven't launched it publicly yet. We've started briefing members of Parliament on it, and started that process of trying to get those policies committed to by all of the parties in the election. But yeah, feel free to have a look at that, and I'll share the link later on. But here's a snapshot. The policy book's called Our Environment, Our Future. And I guess the first thing we're pointing out to politicians is that nature is in decline. We can't afford to continue as we are. We're suffering bushfires, and bushfire seasons that are more intense. They're hotter, they're longer than ever before. The rivers in New South Wales are currently flowing, but make no mistake, when La Nina ends and we go back to drier years, our rivers again will dry out, and we will have hundreds of millions of fish dying in fish kills again, because the water extraction from rivers in New South Wales that are the lifeblood of Western New South Wales is simply too much. There's too many straws in the glass. It's an unsustainable level of extraction. And so, every time there's a drought, our rivers dry out 3 years earlier than they would have, were we not undertaking these huge levels of extraction. And the last picture, that's a Palmer wallaby that was added to the threatened species list just 2 weeks ago, along with 15 other species and ecologies across New South Wales. And we now have over 1,000 species on the threatened species list. So that means they're officially headed towards extinction. And that's a real shame. And, it just shows that our laws, our policies are not up to scratch for holding back that decline of biodiversity, and really the unraveling of the web of life that we rely on for fertilizing our crops, the forests that clean our water and air, and all the other, wonderful things that our environment provides for us. We depend on our planet, we depend on the environment we live in, not the other way around. So I might actually come back to this slide about what our plan is for the next few months, and jump straight into the policies. So firstly, on climate, the first thing is science-based climate pollution reduction targets. So it's all very well to have policies on electric vehicles and the energy transformation, but who's checking to make sure that those policies are going to do what's needed to avoid the worst impacts of climate change? And we need to make sure that the pollution reduction targets are science-based. That's a policy that both parties should be able to adopt, that they will check and make sure that our policies are in line with science. We want to set an offshore wind target for New South Wales. Offshore wind is an industry that is moving ahead in Victoria. And in New South Wales, developers are interested. There are a lot of projects proposed off the coast, especially off the Hunter Coast and the Illawarra Coast. But those projects will not go ahead unless there's more certainty provided by government, because it's a big new industry. Currently we have 0 offshore wind turbines in New South Wales, and we will never get offshore wind turbines unless we set a target and set the policies in place, a plan to bring that industry to New South Wales. And it's an industry that's already playing an important role in other parts of the world like Europe. And it's so important because we need to bring in more and more renewable energy. We need to speed up the scale that we're putting in renewable energy. And currently we're hitting barriers. We're hitting barriers in terms of the amount of transmission that we have out to our renewable energy zones. We're hitting barriers in terms of bringing the communities in those renewable energy zone areas along the ride and making sure that they're not just host to a bunch of developments that they don't want and they're concerned about. So offshore wind is an important piece of the puzzle. And as we go beyond just providing electricity for the things we currently provide electricity for, and electrify our cars and our trucks and our trains and our buses, and electrify, take gas heating out of the equation and gas cooking, and start to electrify industry and move that steel smelter down at the Illawarra, the BlueScope Steelworks, move that from burning coal to using clean renewable-based hydrogen for producing steel. We'll need a lot more renewable energy, and that's where offshore wind comes in. So I'm very excited about that policy and convincing parties to take that important step. And like I said, Victoria's already done it. So what's holding New South Wales back? Number 3 is helping households reduce their energy bills and improve energy security with 2 initiatives. So one is 300,000 home batteries that can help to stabilize the grid and help people to use more of that solar energy in the evenings, and bringing in mandatory energy standards for rental properties so that people in rental properties aren't stuck with paying huge electricity bills for providing a comfortable home for people to live in. And I think those last couple of policies, and there are a few other in that suite of electrifying. People have read Saul Griffith's book or seen his presentations. There's a lot that we need to do to electrify our households and make them more energy efficient. It's a huge opportunity, and I think now is the time, because we are in a cost of living crisis. I showed earlier how environment and climate was a number 1 issue in the last state election. At the moment, the number 1 issue is cost of living, because it's going up at such a spectacular rate. Putin's invasion of Ukraine has caused global coal and gas prices to just go into the stratosphere, and that's impacting us in Australia. Our electricity bills are already going up. Next year, they're likely to go up by 35%. It's a huge jump, and some of us can afford that, and for others, that's going to be a real struggle. So now is an amazing opportunity to get in place some policies that help to shield people from that price of coal and gas, and at the same time, help to transition us to clean sources of energy and reducing energy wastage. So that's some ideas that we want to be pushing on climate, and I'm sure that there's lots of other groups that we can be working with, from social justice groups, renters' rights groups, climate and clean energy groups to make sure that those policies are adopted by the major parties. Forest and wildlife is another important area for Nature Conservation Council and our members. And the top of our list is ending native forest logging. Now, that policy alone is likely to save around 2 million tonnes, or maybe more, but a conservative estimate is 2 million tonnes of carbon dioxide emissions every year from New South Wales, because cutting down our native forests is a huge source of emissions. And then, of course, when we have healthy forests, those forests are a very important store of carbon. They can continue to absorb and store more and more carbon as they become older and larger. So ending native forest logging is a really important goal for biodiversity and for climate. Part of that is establishing the Great Koala National Park, and I'm sure a lot of people on this call are aware, that just this year koalas were listed as endangered, and the biggest driver of the decline of koala populations has been the loss of habitat. And of course, that was compounded by the Black Summer fires in 2019-20. So protecting the habitat they have is a really important policy. And then the third one is auditing those carbon values of our state forests. So at the moment, Our native state forests are being logged. This is a photo from the south coast down at Mogo State Forest. But we think that there's far more value in those forests by leaving the trees in the ground, letting them absorb carbon. And if you look at current carbon prices, the state would be much better off financially as well. So it's not just environmentally the right thing to do, but economically. And we need the parties to start doing that work of figuring out how much it's worth to actually look after those trees and protect them. And finally, protecting all koala habitat. So at the moment, the current government has really opened up clearing of koala habitat, and that's something that needs to be fixed up. We have a bunch of other areas as well in our policy document, but I might let you read them at your own leisure if people want to follow the link. So rivers, I already talked about a little bit. We've got some policy ideas there, including improving First Nations access to water, managing the system as a whole, and making sure that New South Wales does its bit to meet the Murray-Darling Basin Plan targets. At the moment, we're failing dismally on that. Planning, of course, net zero buildings, making sure that our communities have green canopies and have targets for how much green space there is in development. So a lot of those policies that the government was thinking about, but then caved to pressure from developers. We need to bring all those back on the table. National parks, we need to hit 30% of our land area should be protected. And that's a target that Australia has signed up to internationally, 30 by 30 it's called. But the government at the moment has no plan for how to reach it. And we want the state government to make the same commitment to make sure that New South Wales biodiversity has a chance and has the habitat it needs to thrive. And of course, people are probably aware the Warragamba Dam is a very topical issue at the moment. The current government's decided it wants to go ahead and raise that dam, but of course raising the dam will flood a large part of the World Heritage Area of the Blue Mountains. And this environment is not designed to be flooded. So that will have catastrophic impacts on nature and also release a lot of carbon dioxide as those parts of the ecosystem, are flooded and die and release the carbon that are stored in those forests. Also, a lot of policies on waste for moving away from this huge amount of plastic waste that's currently thrown into the environment every year. So that's a snapshot of the policies that NCC is pushing for at the election. I hope there's some in there that get you excited. And now I'm just going to skip right back to that slide on the plan. So like I said, Nature Conservation Council is very keen to take this opportunity to take a big step forward for climate and the environment. And of course, that's all about supporting the groups on the ground, like Climate Action Burwood Canada Bay, to really, push the issues and put pressure on MPs. So, we've got sort of three phases in mind for our campaign strategy. And the first one is boosting our issues in key seats. So that means making sure that our members of parliament and our candidates, as well as, our neighbours, know about what's at stake, what needs to be done on climate, what needs to be done for nature. Phase two is engaging with our MPs. So, taking that grassroots support that we've built in the community and making sure our MPs know there are people in your electorate who care about these issues and who are, putting pressure on you to act. And then the third phase is directing voters to the best policies. So after we've, gone out there, we've engaged with our candidates and we've told them what we think is required. We need to be able to communicate that to voters, and whether that's through door knocking or flyers or scorecards or social media, there's a lot, or events, lots of ways that we can make sure we get the message out about which parties have the best policies on climate and environment, so that people can make informed choices about the next government. All right, sorry, I'm just going to skip forward through all those policies once again. And yeah, this now is sort of like what can your group do? What can we all do at a grassroots level? And I think there's plenty of inspiration to take from the federal election and the previous state election. So, I would say there's really three steps. One is growing our movement. What can we do to get others involved? Invite people to get involved. Invite people to get skilled up and take more action. And, going along to the Bunnings barbecue and the trivia night sound like really great ways to get involved. And I guess think about who else could you invite? Is there somebody else who's interested in seeing more action on climate and the environment who would want to get involved? Secondly, getting the word out into our neighbourhoods, hosting events, stalls, door knocking, leaflet signs. And I think your group already has some really great experience and great runs on the board in that sort of work. And then thirdly, applying political pressure. So, I think both parties need to come out with strong climate policies. We don't want either party going into government for the next 4 years and thinking, I don't have to do anything on the climate. I just have to take care of cost of living. We've got to make sure that this is an issue on the radar for both parties. And that means, every electorate's important. I talked about some of those electorates that we think there'll be even more focus, like Lane Cove. So if you feel like traveling a little bit, then, helping out perhaps with an event in Lane Cove, or, another marginal seat is Parramatta down in the other direction. That's some good places that we can really pile in and all, build on each other's work to make sure that we're applying political pressure where it will make a difference. But yeah, writing to MPs and candidates, having meetings with them, calling their offices on the phone, and when we do have events, making sure we pack them out. We turn people out. We really show that there's a demand in our communities for action. That's all from me on the slideshow. I really look forward to your questions and discussion. But yeah, thanks again for having me, and hopefully people have posted some questions in the chat, and yeah, looking forward to it.
Oh, thanks, Brad. There are a ton of questions in the chat. Yeah, there's no problem there. Thank you very much. You've certainly been addressing questions we've started to think about. We haven't really given much thought to the state election at all. Many of us can't see much difference between the major parties. So we ran a huge campaign during the federal election, but the issues were very clear there. It was very black and white. We represent 2 state electorates here, Strathfield and Drummoyne. Strathfield is now reasonably safe, I think, with Jason Lee as the member. We've got very good contacts with Jason. He's good personally on climate. In Drummoyne, that's John Sidoti's seat, and he's up before ICAC. Nobody knows what's happening there, so Labor hasn't chosen a candidate. We just don't know what's going to happen there. So we're open to all suggestions. So Sean is going to pose the questions that people have put up there, and I'll hand over to you, Sean.
Thank you very much, Ken. And I'm sure I speak for everyone when I thank you, Brad, for that thought-provoking and insightful speech. And I'd like to take this opportunity to remind everyone that time is limited. I think we have 21 minutes before we're scheduled to wrap up this evening's events. And so there are quite a large number of questions, and it is possible that not all of them will be asked, but we'll do our best. And if you do have any further comments or questions to make, the chat is open and will remain open for the rest of the call. I'm going to take these questions in the order that they came in, not in terms of urgency. So the first question that we've got up here was, are there any real policy differences between the Labor Party and the Liberal Party in New South Wales insofar as climate conservation or the environment is concerned?
Yeah, great question. And I see a few people had that one. And I think, people have sort of said, well, I don't see the difference. And I think that's about right. There isn't a huge difference on, let's just start with climate, the climate part of that. There isn't a huge difference. Like I said, the target's identical, 50% by 2030. But nevertheless, I think that is a huge opportunity there. So, which party will commit to an offshore wind target? Which party will commit to assessing its targets against the science? We don't have an act. We don't have a climate act in New South Wales. The Labor Party has proposed one, so that's, I guess, a tick in the Labor column. And so bringing in some of that accountability and transparency around the target, I think, is really important. Who will help households to electrify and reduce their bills and go to clean energy? We're a leader on rooftop solar, but there's still so much to go. There's still so many roofs that don't have systems on them, and that's such low-hanging fruit in terms of reducing bills, at the same time as taking action on climate and kicking coal out of the system. So I think at the moment, it's hard to see a huge difference. But I think a big part of our job is pushing the parties to make those commitments. So whether or not there's a big difference, we need to make sure that there's a race to the top and that we're achieving things in the next few months, the next 5 months. On environment, there is a bit more of a divide. So the Labor Party still hasn't announced a lot of its policies, and it probably won't announce them until like quite late this year or early next year. And I think we do need to give the parties time to respond. So that's sort of why we have that three-phase approach, where at the beginning we're raising the profile of the issues and we're starting to build pressure on MPs, but we're not trying to rate them and direct people to which party's better until next year, when parties have had a chance to really respond to our pressure. So yeah, I think that's the approach we need to take, but there is a bit more differentiation when it comes to land clearing and forests, especially in terms of the record of the parties. So the last Labor government brought in the Native Vegetation Act. It was the coalition government that removed it, and caused land clearing rates to double. So there is a bit of track record there, but in terms of who's going to take the next step and start to fix some of those things, I don't think we've seen the commitments yet. So we can't really rate them today.
Thank you very much, Brad. There are quite a number of questions and comments up here with regards to teal independence and Greens in New South Wales state politics. I understand that the teal candidates will not be focusing on integrity, as it's an issue that's, as it were, done and dusted in New South Wales, and that they're going to be pivoting instead to focusing on planning and those sorts of issues, development, overdevelopment, land use, public spaces, and so on. But in terms of climate, do you have any indication yet as to what sort of manifesto the Teals as a group will be taking to the election campaign? And do you think that that might pressure parties like the Labor Party or the Greens to take a more firm stance on climate? Do you think it might push them to the left, in other words?
Yeah, great question. So I guess firstly, I saw that that there are teal candidates in Vaucluse, Lane Cove, Willoughby, North Shore. There's also an independent candidate up in Oxley, where the Nationals members resigning, and an independent did quite well there in the federal election. So that's sort of 5 seats that I know about. Also, I think even further up the Northern Beaches, so Wakehurst and Pittwater, there's also likely to be teal candidates. So there could be around 7 teal candidates. In terms of like how much they'll focus on climate and what those climate demands will be, I don't know. I don't know if that's been settled yet. But you probably all know Climate 200, which is run by Simon Holmes Accord and others. And Climate 200 is out there looking for candidates to support those teal candidates that do have a strong climate agenda. So I think a lot of those campaigns are going through their community pre-selection processes, so they don't all have candidates locked in yet. But I do think it's a great, that what Teal Wave is a great opportunity to push, I would say, especially the coalition, because often those candidates are going up against coalition MPs in coalition held seats. So I think it's actually a big opportunity to push the coalition to do better on climate and on development, frankly. And like I said, there were quite a lot of good development policies, and some of them are really important for climate. We need to be building cities where people can walk around and leave the car at home. We need to be building houses that are ready for zero emissions and don't have black roofs and require huge air conditioning bills. So I think there is a lot of overlap there, and potentially the Teals could push the coalition especially to take better policies on that. What impact it will have on the Greens and Labor, I'm sort of less sure. Yeah, we'll see. But I do think there will be a race to the top. I think if we can get the coalition to announce the policy or Labor to announce the policy, there will be pressure on the other party to match it. At the moment, I think Labor especially is playing small target. They don't really want to announce anything. So, if it's Teals or if it's the coalition announcing thing and they have to match and beat targets, I think that's where we'll really get some progress.
Yeah, brilliant. And that was sort of what I was saying. And also, presumably, the Greens won't want to look as though they're light on climate or lighter on climate than the Teals. So we have a question here. The recent ACF focus group showed that the public is not currently with us in terms of their beliefs and feelings about fossil fuel exports, limiting or banning fossil fuel exports. It seems likely that politicians, at least mainstream politicians, won't act on this issue until public opinion changes in some noticeable way, especially in marginal seats and in resource communities. And so how can we achieve the movement in public sentiment that is likely to lead to real political change?
Yeah, it's such a hard one. And I think right now is actually the hardest time for this issue because we actually have a global shortage of energy. Of any kind of energy, because of the war in Ukraine. So it's a really tricky time to say, like, let's dial back our energy exports because at the moment, especially in Europe, they're sort of falling over themselves to find anything just to heat homes. And so, I do think this is a transition where we can't just say, like, let's take away the bad stuff without saying, let's put in the good stuff, let's put in the clean energy. And so it does need to be a process, it needs to be a transition. But I think, some of the pieces of that puzzle are already coming into place. And people are probably aware that, especially in the Hunter and to some extent in the Illawarra, there's a real move towards saying, let's set those places up as what are called renewable energy industrial precincts. So basically areas where Australia can use its clean energy advantages to revive manufacturing. And I do think that's a smart way to approach that problem because at the moment, I think some of the concern is, well, if we stop mining coal and gas, what about those jobs? What about those communities? So I do think we need a positive vision. And I think there is one because, Australia has such good sun and wind resources. And the price of those just continues to come down. What a great opportunity for us to power our manufacturing industry, to power green steel. It's such a competitive advantage for Australia. And so I think the more that we can get a move on with those renewable energy industrial precincts and building up manufacturing bases, especially in the Hunter, the Illawarra, and let's not forget Lithgow on the other side of the Blue Mountains, I think we can start to change that conversation away from, the costs and concerns and fears of moving away from mining fossil fuels to the opportunities and benefits of having, reviving manufacturing through clean energy. I think that's the way we need to play it. And I think, it'll be a steady step-by-step process. I think there's also opportunities around highlighting the worst impacts of coal mining and gas mining and trying to knock those off. So, there's a lot of methane emissions from coal mines, and that's something we need to be getting on top of really quickly. So hopefully we can get some policy progress on stopping some of those worst mines and the gaseous mines that are just letting huge amounts of methane into the climate. So yeah, and that's sort of how I think we need to approach that problem. But I would say, for this election, let's go where the opportunity is. And I think cost of living is creating a great opportunity for us to get some wins on the board.
Oh, brilliant. Thanks, Brad. You kind of touched on and answered a couple of questions there. What is the NCC's opinion on the net zero plan vis-a-vis transport? And do you think that we need to be doing more on transport? So much of the focus in the debate is on, as you know, energy transmission and production and supply. Is there anything that we or grassroots groups like ours should be pushing for with regards to transport, investment in transport infrastructure, and changing the transport mix?
Yeah, great question. So the current state government's done, has made quite a lot of announcements on transport. So there's an electric vehicle superhighway program, and there's an interactive map where you can look at where, all the new charging stations are going to be to try to help bring on the infrastructure that will allow electric vehicles to come into play. There's programs to help companies change their fleets over to electric vehicles, which is a good policy because it means we'll get more vehicles into the country. Those vehicles will eventually end up, in probably just a few years, end up on the second-hand market and, really start to create those tipping points in terms of electric vehicles. One of the concerns I have is that the government has been very slow to deliver on its transport promises. So you probably remember it was, I think, 2019 when Andrew Constance, Transport Minister, said we'll have 100% buses, electrified buses by 2030. And then they kind of did nothing for a few years. There was no money in the budget. There were some pilot projects being run, but I don't think we need pilot projects. We know electric buses work. We need to roll them out. And then that's sort of what hasn't been happening. And now the government's saying, oh, maybe 2042, 2045. So yeah, it's a bit disappointing that some of those commitments haven't been implemented. And I suppose we have to take that into account when we're assessing how parties are going and what their commitments are. And hopefully we can get some commitments around speeding some of that up. I think there's lots of great opportunities. Garbage trucks, changing those to electric vehicles, it'll be less diesel fumes in our neighborhoods, less noise, and better for the climate. So yeah, I think in terms of the government's existing plans on transport, kudos. I think they made some good plans. Unfortunately, they haven't really delivered yet. So I think, we need to be calling on them to get it done.
Oh, thank you very much. So you may have seen that our eminent Premier Dominic Perrottet has, in the last couple of days, in spin kind of reminiscent of ScoMo, said that with regards to raising the Warragamba Dam wall, he is on the side of people and not plants. This, to the average punter, would seem to be a really rather compelling piece of spin. How would you respond to that from the conservation environment perspective?
Well, when Dominic Perrottet says people, really he means property developers. He's putting in place a policy that allows property developers to build thousands of homes on a floodplain. That's mad. That's not good for people. That's good for a few property developers. And when he says plants, he's talking about our World Heritage Area, and he's talking about the wildlife. He's talking about our biodiversity. So I think he's, it's sort of, I think, taking the electorate for granted a little bit. He's trying to, think we're going to not see past that spin. And actually, I think there are a lot of people concerned about inappropriate development. And I don't think many people do support building more houses on the floodplain. So yeah, I think it's probably disappointing. And I think it doesn't really stand up to any kind of scrutiny. Maybe, 3-word slogans are effective, but I think we have some very strong arguments to push back with.
Great. So as you, I'm sure, would be aware, there is a very heated debate happening both in Macquarie Street and in Canberra with regards to taxation at the moment. Now, in terms of New South Wales state politics, obviously the Premier is currently proposing reforms to taxation, which he hopes will increase taxation revenue in the long term with his stamp duty reforms, although he's had to dial them back. But is there any, do you think that there's any potential to push either of the political parties on a kind of windfall profits tax along the same lines as Johnson went with in the United Kingdom?
Or even closer to home, the Queensland government has implemented.
Yes.
coal. So absolutely, you had Tim Buckley on the program a few weeks ago. $23 billion is what's on the table by fixing the New South Wales royalties regime for coal. At the moment, we're all seeing, everyone in New South Wales is seeing their electricity bill go up because the price of coal and gas has gone up. Where does the money go? It goes to the electricity companies who pay it to the coal producers. And so, the coal miners on both the exports and the domestic side are making these huge profits off, the pain of households. And at the end of the day, the state owns the resource. That's the people of New South Wales who own the coal. I think it's outrageous that our royalty regime doesn't capture some of those windfall profits. And $23 billion goes a very long way. Our health system is sort of like creaking at the seams. We need new hospitals in places. We need to pay nurses properly. It's to me, I think there's a lot of really strong arguments why we should be taxing, or it's not even tax, just fixing royalties. Even before the recent changes, the Queensland royalty payments that coal miners had to pay were double the New South Wales payments. So in New South Wales, it was 7%. In Queensland, it was 15%. And then they've made, further changes where if the companies are making sky high profits, if they're selling coal for over $100, over $200, over $300, and at the moment it's more like over $500, then they pay an increasing percentage back to the taxpayers, back to the public funds, and it's such a sensible regime. And I was in Parliament last week actually, and a Liberal MP asked me about that. He's like, "Oh, do you think the Queensland government's going to get away with it? Do you think the coal mining industry is going to have a big backlash and run a big ad campaign and somehow turn back these royalty changes?" And the answer is no. Like the mining companies are running TV ads in Queensland, and the Queensland government's running ads back, and they're saying everyone needs to pay their fair share. If we want to have a hospital system that can cope with COVID pandemics and other things, everyone needs to pay their fair share. And I think that really resonates with the public. And you know what? The Queensland government has billions of dollars more that it can spend to get that message out, because it's charging royalties properly, and that's a huge opportunity for New South Wales. It's in our platform. Will the party grab that opportunity? I don't know, but I think we should be making that argument very strongly.
Great. Now, perhaps, we are coming up to the end of our session here. We've got a minute left, but perhaps if you'll indulge me one more question. Got a question here about the coalition's prospects of losing the next election, perhaps a little bit of clairvoyance. Do you think that if the coalition did lose the next election, and perhaps if some of its well-known moderate members were taken out by Teals, as was the story in the federal election, do you think that there's any chance that they might backtrack on climate policy and try to pivot more towards a line that the federal branch of the coalition is?
Yeah, it's such an important question, and good thinking by whoever put that in there. It's a risk. It's a risk. I think in New South Wales it's a much smaller risk than it is federally, because in New South Wales the moderate faction of the Liberals has more numbers than the right-wing factions. So yeah, I think it's a much smaller risk. And also, if those Teals start to chip away at the Liberal heartland seats, I think especially in New South Wales, the Liberal Party, if they do go in that direction, then they really face being unelectable. And especially if climate groups and environment groups continue to do our job and boost the profile of our issues and build our movement and put that pressure on in elections, a party that doesn't have good climate commitments just won't be able to be elected. And so I think climate concern is steadily increasing. We're seeing more and more impacts. I think it's a risk, but I think there's a lot of things on our side that won't happen in New South Wales the way that Dutton has done it on a federal level.
And on that, obviously, as you say, the moderate faction has a clear majority almost a 90% majority in New South Wales and has had for its, the New South Wales branch of the Liberal Party is the moderate heartland. But the federal strategy in terms of electioneering seems to be doubling down on the kind of nationalism and protectionism, the sort of alt-right approach to winning some of those outer suburban seats. And the New South Wales branch, on the other hand, as you say, is taking a more moderate tack, given their the factional makeup of their caucus. And so do you think that we might see, and this is more kind of a political science question, I guess, but do you think we might see a situation where the Liberal Party at national level, the Liberal Party at a state level will actually be targeting different voters and targeting different seats?
Yeah, look, it's totally possible. It's totally possible. No one can predict the future, but I think it's equally possible that the lesson the New South Wales Liberal Party takes from this election is Perrottet shouldn't have been premier. It should have been Keane, and let's move further to that direction. Like you said, they've got the numbers.
Well, I think that probably ends our session tonight. We've run a couple of minutes overdue, and we try as much as possible to end at the time we advertise. Thanks very much, Brad, for that. It was a fantastic presentation, every bit as good as the others we've had this year. And we hope to have you back sometime in the future.